Thank you, Dr. McDonald. Wonderful to be here and to be with those who are engaged in the issue and the matters of bringing the gospel to our world. I come to you as a friend. I'm in my 42nd year of public ministry. All my life, I've loved the church. Since I was a child, well, I don't know whether you've ever heard my testimony, but when I was very young, deep in sin, sleeping around, shooting everything I could, including peanut butter, at the age of 4, God reached down and rescued me. I can never remember not loving the Lord Jesus. I was raised in a minister's home and always felt that my life was advanced by that marvelous experience of living in the home of Mildred and Hilmer Stiller. It was in that world that I learned to articulate faith. I learned to sing the songs of the church. I loved going to camp meeting because there I could hear 3 to 4 sermons a day, and I loved sermons. My friends thought I was a bit daft, but if they said too much, I'd thump them out afterwards. So much for a good sermon. Now, I was in a church that had real vision. Our camp we had a camp site on the most dense saltwater lake in the world, called Manitou Lake. Now, it's only Pentecostals that can build a summer camp on a dead sea and call it Living Waters Camp. That was my early upbringing. I went to our denominational college after high school, met my wife. We've been married 42 years this August. And from that experience, moved, after a year at the University of Saskatchewan, moved to the U of T. And it was there that the Lord challenged us with respect to the broader cultural issues. It was the 60s. It was the free speech movement. Back then, if you couldn't see us coming, you could hear us coming. And someone quite irreverently said, and if you couldn't see them coming, you could smell them coming. That was the 60s. And in that kind of world, I struggled with faith. I had never really struggled with faith before, but the great questions of faith was at my doorstep, and I wrestled with them every day. In a wonderful way, the Lord met me as a student, clarified my vision, clarified my faith. And for the next 16 years, I spent it in Youth for Christ. In fact, Bob was reminding me that's where we met in the late 60s. I had a music team. We were down in St. John at the church. At the end of those 16 years, and I'm sure that if I had left a year earlier, I would have been a hero. I asked my father once, I said, "Dad, how do you know when it's time to leave?" He said, "You'll know." He was wrong. I didn't. I should have learned a year earlier. But for the next 14 years, I spent my life with the Evangelical Fellowship, which for me was the highlight of my life. It was an opportunity of helping to shape in our nation a voice for evangelical biblical faith, refusing to be sidelined by fundamentalism and refusing to be co-opted by liberalism. We found an orthodoxy and a community of people who believed that it was right for us to engage the larger culture with the prime issues out of a vision that was shaped by God's Word and His revelation to us through Jesus Christ. It was 10 years ago this June. In fact, I recall it was June 26th. Lily and I were at home watching the Blue Jays lose that night. We did a lot of that since 1994. And the school called it was in trouble. We had just finished a marvelous crusade with Billy Graham, the Anglican bishop from Oshawa, Blackwell. He and I were the co-chairs of the crusade. It was a wonderful meeting. It could have ended in enormous disaster. As you remember, Dr. Graham fainted just before the first night, and we had some very difficult issues to deal with. but that in fact became a leverage, a wedge in the door, opening the media to the larger message of the gospel. Just after that, I was called, and the question was, would you help us? A school that had been around since 1894 was about to collapse. And so when Lee invited me to come here to be with you these days, I come to you out of a life experience very much framed and shaped by biblical story and metaphor. As I said early, I learned the stories. My mother would read to us at night the wonderful stories. As I would listen to preachers tell the story, as I learned early in my life to value the storytelling form, that really has shaped my life. And as you'll see tonight and tomorrow night especially, that it's the biblical story that frames both my understanding of life and has given me vehicles by which I can hear the call of the Lord at particular times. It's through the stories and the characters of stories that I've learned. So as I come tonight speaking to you about leadership and ministry in the 21st century, I'm not here to say, here's what I think we should do. I don't want to be presumptive with you in your world, which is different than mine, which is different from others. But what I thought I could best do is go at the core issues that I have come to observe, and I simply share them with you, hopeful that out of that sharing you will find some things that begin to resonate with you and settle in the cracks of your life that you've wondered, where in the world can you find the mortar to build up those essential building blocks in your ministry. I also realize that for me, every conference I attend, there are three things I'm looking for. I'm looking for to have my mind pushed outside of the normal corners they habitate. I want to find new ideas. Secondly, I want to find sermons to preach. And third, I need stories to tell. I'll kill for a story. Well, not quite. Well, I think at times. So I hope that out of this will come ideas, stories, outlines, sermons for you to preach, to ideas that will spark an idea that will send you in a new direction, but may give you a framework or at least a starting point. The books that are here and the books that have not yet arrived are books, more recent books that I have written. The first one deals with suffering. The two books that are here tonight, the one is on suffering, when life hurts. Some time ago, my wife and I were in Vancouver with our son and daughter-in-law and our grandchildren. And we were down by the waterfront. We had had dinner in a restaurant, and we were walking along the street, and there was a bookstore. And like you, a magnet draws me. I could close my eyes and walk right into a bookstore, wherever they are. So I was nosing around, and I heard our son Murray say, "Dad, come and take a look." So I walked around a shelving of books, and there was a table that was obviously selling or demonstrating. And I realized it was New Age. There was Egyptian incense, and there was candles, and a bunch of... And in the middle of it, they were featuring my book, When Life Hurts. I thought, well, that's very interesting in a New Age bookstore. And then I realized my subtitle is a threefold path to healing. So I guess they figured that was New Age. That book simply deals with the matters of healing coming out of suffering. It began with a life experience within our family, and that's what that book deals with. The second one is what happens when I die. Now, it's not a subject that I would have written, but in writing for HarperCollins, a secular Canadian publisher, they had wanted a book on life after death. And I said, well, I don't believe that all paths lead to the same place. And they said, fine, just write us a book. We'll be happy with what you do. Well, then I got into the matter of life after death, and I realized that I had built up romantic notions of life after death that found no biblical precedent in the Scriptures. It's almost like the lint that you pick up as you walk through the day. And I had picked up lint of ideas. And so I struggled I thought initially that I would simply find pieces to the puzzle of what heaven was like, and I would put that together, and then I realized that there weren't sufficient pieces in the New Testament. I came to a new understanding of not what life is like after death so much as what is life like before death, Because life is the continuity. Life after death is the continuity of life as it is now, and especially as it was before the fall. It was a deep, theological, enriching experience for me. It transformed my vision of heaven, but it gave me a completely new vision of what life is and the way I minister and the way I live. So that's that book. The other two books that are arriving, the other one is Jesus and Caesar, Christians in the Public Square. It's a social political book looking at what is the role of biblical faith within the context of a secular and pluralistic world. Of course, the very issue that we deal with today with respect to same-sex marriage and other public policy issues, that's really at the heart of this book, of struggling with what is the role of biblical faith in Caesar and Jesus. How do we live out that life? And then the fourth book is Preaching Parables to the Postmodern. And what I've done, this really is a book for pastors and teachers. I've taken 10 parables, done an analysis of all those parables, suggested how we could look at them exegetically and homiletically, and how we might preach those today. My simple theory is that in a postmodern age, or in any age at all, stories, they simply dip below the radar of most people, and they are the most susceptible form of communication. And so I simply use parables as a way of encouraging us as preachers and teachers to use the parabolic form as a marvelous way of unfolding biblical truth in today's contemporary culture. So those are the books. Tonight, what I want to deal with is an understanding of vision. Tomorrow night, I would like to take that further and move into 3 examples in Acts of how vision was transforming for individuals and how that impacted the church. And then on Wednesday morning, I'm going to deal with a vision issue that comes to us out of a couple of wonderful stories out of the Old Testament. And then Wednesday evening, ask the question, what is the fundamental modifier for Christian leadership? And I ask the question, are we making too much out of servant leadership? And my challenge is that maybe servant leadership is not the prime biblical metaphor or modifier for leadership. But we'll deal with that Wednesday night. Let's have a prayer tonight. Father, I thank you for my colleagues, those who care about the gospel being known in our society. I thank you for their lives and their commitment to the church and to the ministry and to the witness of Christ. In this age, as in any age, we struggle with a whole number of factors that sometimes push us to the edge. And we wonder, am I able to lead this congregation? Am I able to lead this ministry? Am I competent enough to answer the questions that are being asked? Do I have sufficient energy to deal with the inertia that seems to take hold of this congregation or of this mission or of this ministry? Tonight, as we look at the story of Nehemiah, I pray that you would, by your Spirit, drop into our minds those catalytic ideas that would be transformative, that would move us from where we are, that would inform us about issues that we really find perplexing, that you would give us encouragement in moments we find so depressing, and that you would enliven our minds to think about what our call is from you and how we can affect that call and thus be encouraging to the church all around us and honor and love you in the process. We give you thanks through Christ our Lord. Amen. Growing up on the Canadian prairies, I had 2 dreams of what I might become. The first dream you could understand, for you see, I learned to play shinny hockey on the lane between the little church that I was raised in, Elam Tabernacle, and Gordie Howe's parents. You can't get much more Canadian than that. And so I had great dreams of being the great hockey player. And of course, just outside of Saskatoon, we had the Bentley brothers. Those of you that are under 60, you have no idea what great hockey was all about until you saw the Bentley brothers play. Doug and Bev and Pat. That was my great dream. But also, as I mentioned earlier, I had a dream of being a preacher. In our church, the significant others were preachers. They were the ones that held us in attention. I'll never forget, as a 7-year-old boy, Mother taking us 5 kids, down to the Saskatoon Arena on a Sunday afternoon to hear Chuck Templeton preach. I love preaching. I love to hear preaching. And my dream was to be a preacher. But a dream is very different to a vision. A dream is a fantasy, a fabrication of self-interests and wishes, driven by motivations that are mixed with altruisms, romantic desires, ego, and personal interests. They come and go. They're like the cut flowers that I did buy for my wife Thursday before I left. They blossom in a moment, and then quickly they're gone. They fold and die. A vision is something different. It captures and it drives my life. It may have moments of fantasy. It might occasionally dabble in unrealistic plans. But for a dream to be a vision, it needs to take hold of my life, my ambitions, my resources, and my energy. An exuberant fan once spoke to the great pianist Paderewski after one of his great concerts. And the fan said, "Sir, I'd give my life to play like that." Paderewski said, "I did." What we do as leaders begins with a compelling vision. I wonder where the world would be today if Wilberforce hadn't given up his lives to bring down the pillars of slave trade. The son of a wealthy man, he had everything to lose by walking away from the issue and simply enjoying the fruits of his inheritance. Instead, he saw the issue, and the issue became a life-demanding vision. How many more thousands would have lost their lives in this brutal and inhumane practice considered in the late 1700s to be one of the economic pillars of the British Commonwealth? For 18 years, time after time, the British Parliament vetoed or voted down his initiatives. And finally, just before he died, the bill was passed. And that slavery that was promoted and supported for so many years by the British Empire was finally declared illegal. What would this country be if John A. Macdonald hadn't faced down an opposition to build the Trans-Canada Railroad? A daunting task in the formidable territory of this country north of the 49th. A landmass that would only find a future when it was tied together east to west. And this mad idea became the thread that held together and eventually became the prime part of a fabric that would create what we call Canada today. It began with a vision. I wonder if the explosion of evangelistic vision would have ever taken hold if in 1948 in a Bible school in Beatenberg, Switzerland, a Canadian pastor had not challenged those attending this post-war conference. Young men mostly then, although there were some women gathered together at Beatenberg, the Bible college, called together by Youth for Christ, following the decimation of Europe, to ask the question about the future of the church in this new age. Europe was flattened and worn out. Churches, especially in Germany, had lost their credibility. The rest were fatigued by years of war. Young men and women quickly matured by the horrors and stress of war returned home. What would the church do, they asked. And so they gathered. Billy Graham, Bob Pierce, Bob Evans, many others. And there they came to hear and to consider what God was saying to them. They had invited this Canadian pastor, Oswald J. Smith. In meeting after meeting, he asked that one simple, penetrating question. It was this: why should anyone hear the gospel twice until everyone has heard the gospel once? This vision was birthed in the heart of this Canadian pastor missionary. He was anemic, he had health problems, and yet he traveled the world with this one idea, and he asked young men and women everywhere he went, why should anyone hear the gospel twice until everyone has heard the gospel once? And those that were at that 1948 conference said, It was transforming. They had a new understanding, and from that place they spread out around the world. It began with a vision and became a rallying cry for that new generation. In 587 BC, many Jews were taken captive and exiled to Babylon. And tonight, I'm going to read to you from Nehemiah. I'm going to read you a good part of I'm going to read you the first chapter and part of the second to give you the sense and flavor and the feelings of this person that I want to examine tonight. These are his words. In the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa, Hanai, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that survived the exile and also about Jerusalem. They said to me, "Those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates have been burned with fire." When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. Then I said, "O Lord, God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love with those who love and obey his commands, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer. Your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's house, have committed against you. We have acted very wickedly toward you. We have not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws you gave your servant Moses. Remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, 'If you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands, that even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name.' They are your servants and your people, whom you redeem by your great strength and your mighty hand. O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man. I was a cupbearer to the king." In 587, the Jews had been exiled to Babylon. One of the number of the plaguing exiles that dispirited the people of God and robbed the country of its best. But then about 50 years later, in 539, Cyrus, then king, allowed some to return to rebuild the temple. And then about 80 years after they were taken exile, in 457, Artaxerxes allowed Ezra to return, and under his leadership the language was modernized and the work on the Old Testament texts were begun. But it was 445 BC, 142 years after their exile, that the word came to Nehemiah about the disaster facing his home country. And of course, this jewel in the crown, Jerusalem. Now, Nehemiah's rise influence in the Persian world was remarkable. He was a refuge, an exile at that, and he had become a senior in government. Simply an amazing feat. And here, living in luxury in the most powerful of nations, which few achieved, no longer a despised Jew, he had class, status, and influence. Not bad for an immigrant. But his world is about to change. As much as his position, power, and lifestyle was comfortable to him, word came of trouble and catastrophe back home. This home wasn't simply my hometown. It was the seat of his spiritual life. It was the place of religious memory and identity. And as much has been done to reconstruct the temple was now vulnerable. The walls were in despair. So we ask, was this any concern of his? Was it his obligation living in his present home? Why did he consider it his responsibility? We aren't told. Indeed, sometimes there's no logical reason for why a leader catches a vision at a particular moment in time. We're driven out of many complex factors: our family genes, our influencers, our peers in our society. But don't forget that we at all times in all places are his people, lived in by God, his Spirit. Never underestimate his will in your life. When a moment of surprise comes and your heart is strangely moved, don't too quickly cast it aside. Nehemiah didn't. Chapter 2. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before, so the king asked, "Why does your face look so sad when you're not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart." I was very much afraid, but I said to the king, "May the king live forever. Why should my face..." I can just hear this said in more of the Mideast vernacular. "And why should my face not look sad when the city where my fathers are buried and lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" The king said to him, "What is it you want?" Then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my fathers are buried, so that I can rebuild it." Then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me, "How long will your journey take, and when will you get back?" It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. He also said to him, "If it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates, so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah? And may I have a letter to King Asaph, keeper of the king's forest, so that he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple, and for the city wall, and for the residence I will occupy." And because the gracious hand of God was upon me, the king granted my requests. So I went to the governors of Trans-Euphrates and gave them the king's letters. The king had also sent army officers and cavalry with me. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about this, they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. There are 4 questions that come to me as I think about the story of Nehemiah. I asked, what is vision? Where does it come from? What does vision do? And what does it take to fulfill a vision? Let me deal with those 4 areas. First, let me suggest that vision is an idea that stirs your passion. Passion is intrinsic to human personality and indispensable for accomplishment. As much as logic of your view invites people to consider it, you won't get to first base without passion. Passion is that which creates a deep interest and a concern, a feeling or a thought that stays with you, that keeps popping up your mind at the strangest of moments. Vision is linked to passion. Vision is an idea that stirs you deeply. Vision is also that which flows out of your natural gifting. In my years of ministry, as I'm sure you do, people ask, especially young people, although I find at 63, I'm still asking the question, what does God have what's God's will for my life? My wife thinks that I should stop asking that question. She's already got it figured out. She hasn't told me yet, but she's got it figured out. So I ask people who ask me that question, what are your interests? What do you like to do? And those that are intent in serving God, and they've got that kind of that steel jaw set forward and that burning flash in their eyes, you know, the intensity. They say, and what does what I like to do have to do with God's will? I said, just stay with me. What do you like to do? What do you like best to do? What do you do best? Out of all that you like to do, what do you do best? What does that have to do with God's will? Well, could it be that God has gifted you in particular ways, and that His best place for you is to use your gifts in service to Him, and probably what you do best is what you like to do. The two are joined together at the hip. God's creation is remarkable. He links our natural abilities with our driving passion. For Nehemiah, it came from his gifting of leadership. Now, being a cupbearer to Artaxerxes wasn't simply being a waiter. The kings were in threat even in their own palaces. And so the person who was the cupbearer was not only the one that would be the final person that would take of the food or the drink to ensure that it wasn't contaminated, but that person also was the closest advisor to the king, senior minister. And Nehemiah had arrived there out of his ability. He had status and he had influence that had come from his ability and skill. Remember, as a student, we had no notion of gifting back in the 60s. It was a new idea. I recall, I can tell you the person and the place where I first came to understand the nature of Romans 8 and the gifting, the sevenfold gifting. It was a releasing moment for me. I was struggling in the ministry. What I knew that I could naturally do, others thought I shouldn't do because it didn't match what they thought the ministry was about. And they simply were forcing me into a stricture that matched their gifting, not understanding that I had different gifting. And I saw myself as being inadequate because I wasn't fitting with what they thought my gifting should be. But how in the world can I do what I can't do? I mean, our motto back then wasn't use your gifting as service to God. Our motto was burn out for God. You too, Lee? Well, you were Baptist. You weren't sure about that stuff, were you? Vision is what stirs out of your natural gifting. I've got a vocational theory here. Now, I wouldn't go build a new denomination over this theory, but let me give it to you anyhow. My sense is that what we envision is complementary to our gifting. That we don't dream or envision what we aren't gifted to accomplish. I think psychologically, and I've discussed this whenever I have opportunity with vocational counselors, and I've never had anyone who said you're wrong. What I envision in my moment of solitude, in those moments when I wish I could do things, that wishing tends to flow out of my gifting. There is a natural linkage. But also, thirdly, vision is bigger than person. It's of a life-size magnitude. It calls on us to give our lives. Such a vision is sufficiently large to call on not just a passing interest, but our very lives. Nehemiah, he wasn't going back to build a wall. He was going back to save Jerusalem. The wall was only an incidental factor in the ingredients required to protect the temple and to build the great city of David, the city of God. The vision was large enough. It was bigger than himself. It was bigger than his colleagues. It was bigger than Artaxerxes. It was bigger than the comfort and the joy and the prestige of his current moment. It was an idea that was bigger than himself. But fourthly, a vision is born out of kingdom life, is directed in the service of others. I'm speaking within a particular context. I'm speaking about vision within Christian leadership. We get all kinds of ideas, and I find that I'm able to quickly sort out what's of God and what's not. If it's for self, if it's for pride, if it's for accomplishment, and not for the service of the church in this century, in this world, I know that it's something that can be pushed off to the side. But the vision that is compelling of the Spirit is that which is directed toward the service of others. We all get visions or dreams of doing or building or owning something of interest. But for Christian leadership, if the compelling vision is to serve self, it's not driven by a heart for the kingdom life. Nehemiah's vision was to serve his people and his God. Godly vision sees the well-being of others as the primary target. In the marketplace, it's been found that companies that have as their prime target the providing of the finest of goods and services produces a stronger country, a stronger company. For a company whose focus is on the bottom line, they have shown inevitably that that company dies. But a company that has a vision of service by best product, by best service, will produce a strong company and, as a result, produce a strong bottom line. Vision. What is it? It's an idea that rises naturally out of your gifting and your passion. But where does vision come from? Well, it seems to me that first it grows slowly out of one's inner thoughts and insights. It's not something that's normally zapped in from the outside, but it emerges from ideas and feelings and observations, an instinct that merge together and over time become cauterized into a describable idea. I know it by what it does to me. It quickens my mind and emotions as I think about it. It's not unlike, and I think today on Valentine's Day with my wife back in Newmarket, I remember when we dated years ago, it was that absolute joy and excitement about being together. It happens naturally. Vision, I think, happens naturally out of our life experience and our insights. It may be a word that comes from the outside that triggers a thought, but it's that which you feel rising from your own thoughts and insights. But it also may be an epiphany, a word spoken, a word inspired by the Spirit. It could be a time in which God breaks through the clutters of one's search, providing an insight or an idea that becomes over time compelling. I have a very good friend, Jim Cantlin. He was a pastor and a television broadcaster. But he went out to a church in Vancouver and found himself in great difficulty. The church had its own issues, historical issues, and he had walked into the midst of issues that he was required to deal with. And in 36 months, he had to leave. But he found within that moment, out of the disturbing experience of that moment, he found God speaking to him about something that was far away. He was speaking at a pastor's conference in South Africa. And he came face to face with the issue of AIDS in Africa. And in that moment, a vision was birthed. It took a few years for it to be formed, but today Vision Led is a Canadian organization that seeks to bring awareness to the AIDS issue in Africa, both by North Americans and by African church people working together. In my own experience, I can see how a particular idea has been incubating all along. It's been there. It's been in the back of my mind. It's been there in my heart. And at some point, it eventually I become aware of it as an inner reality. Not just out of the blue, but something that's been lingering there. I recall back when I was about to leave Youth for Christ, I was invited to a church in BC. I'd gone out there and had met the board, had preached in the church, and felt that was the thing that I should do. But I decided to take a few days and just go away for a spiritual retreat. And I did something that I had never done before. I took the scriptures and a notepad, and I said, Lord, I'm not sure what I'm looking for, but I need some word from you today. And so as I read through, I came to Nehemiah, and I hadn't read Nehemiah in some time, so I thought, well, I'll just read the whole text through. And so as I read through, I made notes, and when I'd finished, I was surprised to note that I had written, find a broken wall. Whatever you do, find a broken wall. Well, in that moment, I knew that this lovely church from the West Coast, with about a 1,500-member congregation, a weekly television show, just enough to suit my ego, was not a broken wall. I had no idea what it was, but I know that church was not. So I called Phil Dweeb, who was professor of philosophy at Trinity Western. He was chair of the board, and I said, Phil, I can't come. He said, why not? I told him what I had just gone through. He said, Brian, what are you going to do? He said, I have no idea. What I found as I went back some time later through my journal, I had recognized that some years earlier, as I had served as a volunteer with the Evangelical Fellowship, as we had searched for a leader, in my journal entry I had noted a number of times the need for a national voice in Canada. A need for a voice to speak against those that would ridicule those of us of faith. A number of entries that flowed in that genre. Only later did I realize that had been brewing in the back of my mind for years. But it was in this moment, when the Spirit by the Word stopped me from going forward, that vision that had been germinating for some years was eventually given birth. Also, vision is born out of crises. For Nehemiah, it was that. The news was sufficiently sad and overwhelming, but he listened. As C.S. Lewis reminds us, suffering and difficulty is God's megaphone getting hold of our attention. Often we simply miss the story because life is going fine. But when we see catastrophe, we tend to listen. Where I am today, Tyndale, if it had not been in a meltdown in June of '95, it would never have gotten my attention. I had no interest really in the academic world. I loved to work on the front lines, and so this was a whole new world. It was a new business to learn. It was a new kind of operation in which to lead. Sometimes catastrophe gets our attention. The first thing I did, I called George Rawlik, professor of history at Queen's University, a specialist on Baptist history, as you know, here in the Maritimes. And I said, George, what would happen if this school, then called OBCOTS, what would happen if this school went under? I said, where would it fit on the kind of the historical scale of disasters of evangelicals in Canada? He said, Brian, there is nothing to equal it. It would be the greatest of all disasters. That got my attention. But vision will also rise out of heartache and sorrow, the ashes of humiliation of personal sin, or the heartlessness of others. It may come from natural disaster or famine or human manufactured sorrow or war. It may be born out of organizational debacle or personal insecurity and the fight of oppression, persecution, or long and lonely nights of personal travail and agonizing prayer. Vision may be that which is trying to rise out of your current sorrow, malaise, or heartache. The book that's available out there, When Life Hurts, comes from the story of suicide in our family. My oldest brother, his wife lost their 18-year-old daughter in suicide. There's nothing that brings family together like death. Suicide, with its haze, in my experience, even draws one closer together. I watched them as they went through their time of deep, deep sorrow. Suicide allows for no resolve. There's nothing to say, well, that's what happened. You always ask the question, if I had done this, could I have prevented what had happened? And they walk down that very, very dark road. So I watched firsthand a vision being born. My brother, a businessman, had always loved the poor. Successful in business. In that moment, that long moment, it was about an 18-month moment. I watched the vision of caring for the poor burst in his life. It came out of sorrow. It came out of the loss of a daughter. What does vision do? Well, vision lifts us. It calls each of us to raise our eyes from the struggles and the disappointments to see the opportunities. In the darkest of moments, those living in and around Jerusalem, they were ridiculed and opposed. They were fatigued of the long days, dispirited by anxiety over losing what to them was so precious. But they had someone who believed enough in vision to leave the pleasantries and the power of the rich and the sophisticated world of the Persians and return to the backwater of an overrun country. Now they not only had a tub-thumping advocate, but one who could rally the troops. And what a difference that made. The demoralized few had their flame lit. It gave them spirit, hope, and a plan that was worth dying for. A vision will lift people. It will also, out of that lifting, empower people. New thoughts course through people's minds. They can now imagine what a protected city would look like. They can see life being lived out in the protection of a city with walls. And for in those days and in that world, people lived together. The poor and the rich, the farmers and workers, owners and poor, they lived together. They had no choice to protect themselves from the wandering thugs of those that would steal and kill. And so with no police or armies, they had to protect each other. They had to live together. And that common wall kept them safe. The people were empowered. Vision has a way of doing that. Also, vision converges resources. Rather than people going their own way, and synergy comes into play. What one does is no longer for themselves, but for all. For in the coming together, each benefits. The selfish impulse that is so containing and so counterproductive is seen for what it is. Vision gives sight to what can be. It calls us together to share our resources and to blend them together so that we can do what we each do best, freeing the other to do the same. And what I do best, coming together with what you do best, does more than double the output, but becomes a multiplier. We come together when vision is attractive and compelling. And the multiplication of our gifting in that synergistic fashion allows us to do things together that we could never do alone. I watched my brother as he emerged out of that deep hole of sadness and darkness, sell his businesses, reserve enough money for he and his wife to live together, and then to begin the journey of caring for the poor. Today, as World Chair of Opportunity International, he serves an international organization that works as a bank going in to provide microeconomic loans to poor people around the world, to empower them by way of building up of their own collateral, their own business experience and profitability, so that you, rather than giving a person a fish, you teach them to live for a lifetime. But all of that didn't simply come out of a great idea. It was a vision born out of enormous sorrow. But what does it take to fulfill vision? Vision, first of all, needs definition. Vision is more than a fuzzy dream. I love the story of Nehemiah. He said, I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there 3 days, I set out during the night with a few men. I had not told anyone what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. There were no mounts with me except the one I was riding on. By night I went out through the valley gate toward the jackal well and the dung gate, examining the walls of Jerusalem, which had been broken down, and its gates, which had been destroyed by fire. Then I moved on toward the fountain gate and the king's pool, but there was not enough room for my mount to get through, so I went up the valley by night, examining the wall. Finally I turned back and re-entered through the valley gate. The officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, because I had yet said nothing to the Jews or the priests or nobles or officials or any others who would be doing the work. Then I said to them, you see the trouble we're in? Jerusalem lies in ruins. Its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. I also told them about the gracious hand of my God upon me and what the king had said to me. They replied, let us start rebuilding. So they began this good work. But when Sanballat, the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us. What is this you are doing, they asked. Are you rebelling against the king? I answered them by saying, the God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. But as for you, you have no share in. As well, to fulfill the vision, it requires passion. All parts of my life must coalesce. Vision doesn't allow me to divide up my life so that I can pursue an idea intellectually while keeping my distance emotionally. It doesn't become an 8-to-5 job. It captures my life, my waking hours, my finances, and family. All of this in an undergirding, not out of compulsivity, but of self-control. But even so, to be a kingdom leader with a heart for the transformational presence of Christ, I need to understand that vision will take hold of my life. You see, in a society, we don't build monuments to cynics or critics. Look at the monuments on any court, on any central plaza in any of our cities. It's not to the cynics or the critics. It's to the person who challenged and led the vision. You know that behind that statue, behind that photograph hanging on the wall, you know that in their life there has been critics and cynics and those that have attacked and those that have tried to disregard or destroy the vision. Leadership requires it. It happens with leadership. Everywhere you go as a leader, you know it's going to happen. It's inevitable. People not only disagree, they'll attempt to destroy in the body of Christ as well. That is inevitable. But for vision to find its way into reality, it needs someone who heralds the vision, as with Nehemiah, where all parts of life coalesce. That day earlier, when I called Phil Weeb, Vancouver, and said, I can't come, he said, what are you going to do? And I said, I have no idea. We agreed to spend a few days before we'd make a final decision. And about an hour later, I was staying at a friend's place up in Blue Mountain in Collingwood. I got a phone call from a friend of mine, a Baptist minister in Edmonton, Merv Saunders. Amazing how God uses Baptists now and then. Merv, how did you find me? He said, I told Lily it was a call of emergency. I said, Merv, what's the call about? He said, Brian, I've heard about you going to this church in BC. I said, Merv, interesting. I just called and said I wasn't coming. We talked about it, and he said, Brian, I said, well, Merv, if you know what I shouldn't do, as he had just told me I shouldn't go, I said, what should I do? In that moment, he said, Brian, I think you should take on the Evangelical Fellowship. I said, Merv, you don't understand. I said, it's an idea in someone's third drawer. It doesn't have a budget, doesn't have an organization, it has nothing. And the more I described it, the more I realized I was describing a broken wall. Nehemiah had a vision. It's a vision which is essential to our leadership, whether it's the 20th, the 17th, or 21st century. It's no different today than it was then. We live in certain different social, economic, cultural, with those different realities. But the matter of vision is essential to what we do. I suspect that when you and I find we have no energy for the task, when we feel ourselves blanketed by discouragement, we feel the weight of the discouragement of others on us, it could be that we haven't taken our time to articulate and define a vision. Without a vision, the people perish, the Scripture says. And why is that? It's because vision gives clarity. It moves us from where we are to where we could be. It defines not only what is, but will be. It brings people together so that energies are coalesced, gifts become synergistic, and we are lifted and empowered because of the compelling vision. I wonder where World Vision would be today if Bob Pierce, as a Youth for Christ / journalist staff member, was in South Korea. The Dutch missionary put into his arms a little South Korean, and she said, Bob, I can handle no more. I've all I can do. Here, you take this child. Bob looked at the child and he said, I can't look after this child. And he had an idea. He said, what would it cost for you to find a South Korean mother? What would it cost per month to raise that child until the child's a young adult? The Dutch missionary stopped for a moment, thought. She gave an amount. Bob Pierce said, every month until that child is an adult, that money will be here. Bob came back to North America. I'll never forget his message. I was about 9 years of age, the Broadway Theater in Saskatoon on a Sunday afternoon. He told the story. I'll never forget the story. He said, I came back and I got talking to one of our neighbors. And the neighbor said, is there another child that I could support? Started with a vision, an idea. And today, World Vision is the largest non-governmental agency in the world. You can take the great examples, you can take the small examples. You can tell the stories of your life where vision, cauterized ideas brought people together and was transformative in your life and the life of your church. Let me suggest to you, to me, in our ministry today, that the story of Nehemiah become a framework in which we think about vision and it's important to us in leadership in the 21st century.